Welcome back, everyone. So this time, you sent in a whole bunch of stuff really interesting on how international businesses actually, structure themselves.
The nuts and bolts.
Yeah, but let's be honest, it can be a bit dense, right? Like trying to read the blueprints for, I don't know, some massive spaceship.
Yeah.
Our mission here, though, is to break it down, get to the juicy bits, the stuff that helps you really grasp how these global giants are set up, why they make the choices they do, and what it actually means in the real world.
Right, like a cheat sheet to understanding the core DNA of these international businesses. We're gonna be looking at different organizational models, blueprints, if you will, and how things like a company's strategy and that whole crazy global landscape, how they shape how the company is structured.
Perfect. And we've got some great questions lined up, like, have you ever wondered, why some international companies make all the big decisions from their HQs while others give more power to those local teams on the ground? Or how a company's grand plan, their global strategy, how that actually translates into who reports to who?
Right.
We'll also be diving into the pros and cons, the real world stuff of different global organizational structures. Things like separate international divisions, organizing by region, building around global product lines, or even those matrix structures.
Yeah, those can be interesting.
Fascinating. But yeah, it can be tricky. And we'll look at how these huge organizations, the ones that span the whole planet, how they actually manage to coordinate everything across borders. By the end of this, you'll have a way better understanding of how these companies tick, like why they're structured the way they are.
Should be fun.
Yeah, totally. So maybe we could kick things off by talking about how these international companies, how they decide who gets to make the big decisions.
Decision-making power.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, if you go back to Griffin's work back in 2008, he talked about these building blocks of organizational structure. And one of the key ones was this idea of distributing authority, which included delegation, centralization, and decentralization. And Wilcox, too, in 2021, he emphasized, where those decision-making responsibilities actually sit. It's a defining characteristic of how a company is set up.
Got it. So let me unpack that a bit. Centralization versus decentralization. What's the core difference there, in the real world?
Well, centralization basically means keeping most of the power at the top. Headquarters makes most of the big calls. Decentralization, on the other hand, is about spreading that decision-making power down the ladder,
right,
giving more autonomy to those middle managers, even those on the ground in different countries.
So they can react faster to what's happening locally.
Exactly. Now, I know you're thinking about delegation, too.
Yeah, how does that fit into all this?
Good point. So delegation is more about a manager giving specific tasks to their team. It does give them some authority, but it's very task-focused.
Okay.
Decentralization is bigger. It's like a philosophy about how decision-making is spread across the whole company. Think of it this way. Delegation is assigning a part of your homework. Decentralization is deciding who gets to create the curriculum for the whole school.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So it's not like companies just pick one or the other, right?
Definitely not.
It's more like a spectrum. They find their sweet spot somewhere along the line.
Exactly. They both have their pluses and minuses. Smart international companies figure out how to balance them depending on their situation.
Makes sense. So when would a company, when would they lean more towards that centralized approach?
Right.
What are the conditions that make that a good choice?
Okay, well, there are a few things. One is the environment. If things are pretty stable, predictable, they don't need to adapt as quickly to local changes.
Makes sense.
Also think about those lower level managers. Maybe they don't have a ton of experience yet, or they're not really looking to make those strategic decisions.
They just want to focus on their part.
Exactly. So centralization makes things smoother, more consistent. And if the decisions are fairly routine, not earth-shattering, or if there's a big crisis where the top needs to make a fast, unified call, centralization can be really effective.
Right.
Also, smaller companies or those that are geographically concentrated might find it easier to coordinate with the centralized structure.
Right.
Lastly, if the company's strategy is all about tight control, uniformity across the board, centralization's a natural fit.
Makes sense. But then on the flip side, when does it make more sense to decentralize, to push that power out to the teams in different countries?
Well, it becomes really attractive when you're in a fast-paced, constantly changing environment.
Things are unpredictable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need those local teams to be agile, make quick decisions to stay competitive, and if those lower-level managers are skilled, experienced, and eager to take charge...
They want to say?
Yeah. Empowering them through decentralization can be a huge advantage, especially when the decisions directly impact those local markets, those who are closest to the action. They often make the best calls.
Right, they're in the trenches.
They are. And if the company culture is one that values input from all levels.
Everyone has a voice.
Exactly. Or if they're spread out geographically, decentralization makes a lot of sense. And if their strategy depends on being flexible, really tuned into those local customers, decentralization fits perfectly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's about finding the right balance, right, between needing global consistency and being able to adapt to those local realities.
Absolutely. And like we talked about earlier, Wilcox points out that, in international business, that perfect balance can shift depending on what the company's facing.
It's not static.
Right. It's dynamic.
Okay, so we've talked about the general idea of centralization and decentralization.
Correct.
Let's get more specific. Why would an international company lean towards centralization? What are the real benefits on a global scale?
Okay, well, one big one is coordination. It helps align activities across all those different countries and units. Make sure everyone's on the same page, working towards those big global goals.
Yeah, like herding cats.
Kind of. And centralization can be vital when you're making big changes, company-wide stuff.
To keep everyone moving in the same direction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it helps avoid duplication of effort and resources. Like centralizing R&D, research and development, can lead to some serious cost savings.
Economies of scale, right?
You got it. So there's a lot to be said for that centralized approach.
But there's always a but.
Right. What about the other side? What are the advantages of giving those local teams more power, pushing decision-making down to them?
Yeah. What are the benefits there?
Well, for one, it prevents those at the top from getting completely bogged down with decisions.
They'd be drowning.
Totally. And that can lead to slow, maybe even bad decisions, especially if they're not super familiar with those local nuances.
Right, they're too far removed.
Exactly. Decentralization can also really boost morale among those local employees, give them a sense of ownership.
Like they're actually part of the decision-making?
Right. And it makes things clearer in terms of accountability, who's responsible for what in each region. Plus, those local managers, they understand their markets best.
Better than some executive sitting in an office thousands of miles away.
Exactly. They make better, more informed decisions, and decentralization just makes the whole company more flexible, able to react quicker to local challenges and opportunities.
Makes a lot of sense. So it's a constant balancing act, right?
It is.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about strategy. A company's overall plan and how that ties into their organizational structure.
This is a big one.
A fundamental relationship, I think, in international business.
Yeah, for sure. You see, the structure isn't just some abstract chart, it's a tool. It's how a company actually organizes all those diverse activities, all those moving parts, so they can execute their strategy effectively.
Makes sense.
And Chandler, he nailed it back in 1962, and he said, structure follows strategy. And it's crucial to remember that a company's strategy, it comes from analyzing that crazy global environment we talked about.
So they look at the global playing field, figure out how they want to win, and then they design their structure to support that approach.
Exactly. And remember, Wilcox, he emphasizes how structure is a key part of what he calls the organizational architecture.
Right, the bigger picture.
Yeah, the whole system. He argues that good managers, they're always making sure that their environment, their strategy, their structure, and all those other elements of their organizational architecture, that they all fit together, that they're aligned.
So everything works smoothly, like a well-oiled machine.
Exactly. But for now, let's zero in on that strategy-structure connection. Remember those multinational strategies we talked about before? Some structures just naturally fit better with certain strategies.
Right, like different tools for different jobs.
Exactly. Now, Wilcox makes a point that some of those simpler internationalization strategies, like just copying your domestic approach in other countries or focusing totally on being locally responsive, they might not cut it in the long run.
They won't be able to keep up.
Right. Competition's fierce. Everyone's looking to be more efficient, keep costs down.
He says companies that are doing that whole international or home replication thing, they'll probably need to move towards either a global standardization strategy, which is about being efficient, offering pretty much the same product everywhere, or a transnational strategy, which is a bit more ambitious, trying to have both strong global integration and be really responsive to local needs at the same time. And companies that are all about localization, they might need to head towards that transnational approach too.
So basically, the strategy has to evolve as the global landscape changes.
Right. And the structure has to follow suit. Structure follows strategy.
Makes sense. Okay, with that in mind, let's dive into some real-world examples of these structures.
Right, the ones that international businesses actually use.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Wilcox outlines 4 main ones, each kind of tied to a specific global strategy.
Perfect. Let's hear them.
Okay, so we have the international division structure, which often goes with an international or home replication strategy.
Then there's the geographic area structure, which fits well with the localization or multi-domestic strategy. For those global standardization folks, it's the global product division structure. And lastly, for the transnational strategy, you often see the global matrix structure.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. So let's start with the international division structure. What's the gist of that one?
So at the core, a lot of organizations use divisional structures. They split the company into these self-contained units.
Like many companies.
Yeah, almost. And these divisions, they're based on what they create, specific products, services, regions, or markets.
Makes sense.
And they have a good amount of autonomy. Each one has its own resources, departments, everything. Led by a division manager who's responsible for how they do budget, even investments.
Okay.
This promotes decentralization, gives those division heads a lot of freedom. It's different from a functional structure where you group people by their skills, like marketing, production, or R&D.
Right. So how does that international division structure fit within this whole divisional approach?
Well, on a global level, you have this separate international division running alongside the domestic ones. However, Wilcox points out some issues.
There's always a catch.
Right. First, those international division managers, they might not have as much clout compared to those running the big domestic divisions.
I'm kind of on the sidelines.
A bit, yeah. And sometimes there's not much synergy between international and domestic operations. They're not really working together effectively.
So you might miss out on those global efficiencies.
Exactly. So while it's a common starting point, this structure can lead to internal power struggles and make it tough to really integrate globally. Companies need to be aware of that.
Makes sense. So it's like those international operations are treated as a separate thing instead of being truly part of the global strategy.
Yeah, a bit like an afterthought. And you're right, this is often seen in those early days of international expansion.
The first foray into new markets.
Exactly. It's typical with a home replication or international strategy where the need for global integration and local responsiveness are both pretty low. It's often seen as a temporary setup until the company's international presence grows.
They need something more robust as they expand.
Exactly. Okay, ready for the next structure?
Yeah, hit me with it.
Yeah.
What about that geographic area structure?
All right, this one's pretty straightforward. You divide things up based on regions, North America, Europe, Asia, etc. Each region becomes its own unit, and this is really important when those local markets are very different.
Different tastes, cultures, all that.
Exactly. So you can tailor your products, marketing, your whole strategy to each region. Each area has its own set of departments, marketing, finance, HR, production, all focused on that specific region.
So this structure works well with a localization or multi-domestic strategy, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
You're really prioritizing being responsive to those local needs. Global integration isn't the main focus here. A good example is Middle Steel, that big European steel company. They've used this structure.
Okay. But what are the downsides? Because there are always downsides, right?
Always. Wilcox says this approach can lead to fragmentation. Each region becomes its own little kingdom. It makes it harder for HQ to control things.
Too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, sort of. And it can stifle the sharing of knowledge and skills between those different regions.
So you gain local expertise, but you lose some of those global synergies.
Exactly. All right, on to the next one.
Yeah, let's talk about that global product division structure.
Okay, so this one revolves around specific products or services. You basically have a headquarters division for each major product line, and they each have their own resources. They're responsible for that product globally.
So each division is like its own global business.
Yeah, pretty much. The idea is to strategically place your manufacturing and everything else where it makes the most sense for that product.
To be efficient, responsive, all that.
Exactly. A good example is EADS, the European Aerospace Company. Each division, like commercial aircraft or defense, is pretty autonomous. HQ sets the overall strategy, handles the financials. What's interesting is that the goals, how they work, even the products themselves, can be completely different across those divisions. And this structure helps solve some of those coordination problems we saw with the international division and geographic area structures.
So each division can become a specialist in their product.
Yeah, a center of excellence. And this allows them to really leverage those economies of scale, location economies, experience curve effects, all those things we talked about earlier.
They can really maximize their efficiency.
Exactly. And it makes it easier to share those core competencies and know-how across different locations within the division. Plus, it helps with launching new products globally within that product area.
So this structure goes hand in hand with a global standardization strategy, right?
Right on. You're aiming for high global integration, keeping those products consistent, but local responsiveness isn't the main concern here.
Got it. Now let's tackle the last one, that global matrix structure. I'm guessing this one's a bit more complex.
It is. You're basically trying to combine two different structures at the same time.
Sounds tricky.
It can be. It means employees might report to two different managers, which goes against that traditional idea of everyone having just one boss. It's called unity of command.
So it's a bit more like fluid.
Yeah, you have two overlapping chains of command. One might be based on a project, product line, or region, and the other's based on function, like engineering, marketing, finance, etc. You see it in R&D departments, even universities.
Okay. But why would a company choose to do this, to have employees reporting to multiple people?
Good question. Wilcox says it's about achieving several strategic objectives at once. Like, they want to benefit from both global efficiencies and local responsiveness, and they want to make sure they're sharing knowledge and skills throughout the company. It's really designed for that transnational strategy, that sweet spot of high global integration and high local responsiveness.
Trying to have it all.
Pretty much. But there are some downsides, right?
Always.
Dual reporting lines can lead to conflict, power struggles.
Too many bosses.
Exactly. It can also be tough to pinpoint accountability. If something goes wrong, who's to blame? And it can create bureaucracy, slow things down.
It's like a recipe for headaches.
It can be. Wilcox even says that matrix structures are often the first to go when there's a crisis. Everyone just wants things to be simpler.
Understandable.
But he does give 3 keys to making it work.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, crystal clear company objectives, and everyone has to be on board with those.
Alignment, right.
Yes. Second, consistency in how those different divisions and functions operate. And third, clear decision-making processes, so nobody's stepping on each other's toes.
So it can work, but it needs careful management.
Definitely. Okay, we've talked about these 4 structures as if they're set in stone, but that's not really how it works, right?
Right. Companies grow, their strategies change, so their structure probably has to evolve too.
Exactly. It's not a one-time choice. There's a ton of research on this, going back to the late 60s, early 70s. One study by Stopford and Wells in 1972 found a link between how internationally diversified a company is, how much of their sales come from outside their home country, and what structure they're likely to use.
So as companies become more global, their structure changes.
Right. Typically, they start with that international division, then they might go to either a global product division for a global strategy or a worldwide area structure for a multi-domestic strategy.
Right.
And as they get even more global, more diverse products, more sales from abroad, that's when they often move towards a matrix structure, which is a good fit for that transnational strategy.
It's like they're leveling up their structure as they grow.
Exactly. And Wilcox points out that today's global business world is even more dynamic and competitive than back then.
It's a whole different ballgame.
It is. You've got these huge, complex companies, new players popping up, and competition is fierce.
Makes sense.
This has led to flatter organizations, less hierarchy, more reliance on networks and virtual teams.
More agile and flexible.
Exactly. But they still need ways to coordinate and integrate all those moving parts, even more so now.
Right, because it's more complex than ever.
Absolutely. He uses Nestle as an example. They've got this complex structure with centralized functions, global product groups, R&D centers all over the world, and regional organizations. They're constantly adapting.
They think ways to make it work.
Right. And this leads us to this idea of a contingency approach.
Contingency.
Yeah, basically, it means there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Wilcox says this is super relevant for international businesses. The best way to organize depends on the specific situation the company is in.
Makes sense. Like a tailor-made suit.
Perfect analogy. He argues that today's multinationals, they're all about using their resources efficiently, having flexible structures, not too much hierarchy, and really focusing on those integration mechanisms.
So they can stay agile and responsive.
Exactly. And this goes against that old idea of universality in management.
That there are universal rules for every company.
Right, the one best way. Contingency theory says the best way depends on the environment you're in.
So it's not as simple as structure follows strategy in every case.
Right. Gareth Hill, in 2014, he actually criticized that idea. He said companies have choices when it comes to structure, and strategy doesn't dictate one single option.
So there's some wiggle room.
Yeah. He even argues that the structure itself can influence strategy.
Interesting.
Like what resources you have, how you make decisions, it can all shape what strategies you can realistically pursue. So in some cases, strategy can follow structure.
Okay, so it's a two-way street.
It can be, but the key takeaway from a contingency perspective is that both the strategy and the structure have to align with that external environment.
The global landscape we talked about.
Exactly. If those local markets are different, if the competition's tough, you might need different structures to make your strategy work.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. It all comes back to making sure those different parts of the company are working together smoothly.
Alignment is key.
And coordination, right? How they actually manage all those global operations.
Huge. As companies become more global, especially those going for global standardization or transnational strategies that need to collaborate across borders.
That gets trickier.
It does. Wilcox talks about formal and informal mechanisms for integration, and it's important to understand the different types of interdependence between those units, how they rely on each other.
Okay, let's break that down. What are the different types of interdependence?
Sure. So you have pooled interdependence, where units are pretty independent. They just kind of pool their output at the end.
They're working on separate pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly.
Mm.
Then there's sequential interdependence, where one unit's output is the input for another.
Like an assembly line.
Right. And lastly, reciprocal interdependence, which is more complex, a lot of back and forth between units.
Lots of interaction.
Yeah, they're constantly feeding off each other. Okay, so what about those formal integration mechanisms, the official ways companies coordinate globally?
Yeah, let's hear them.
Well, some are simple, like direct contact between managers or using the existing hierarchy to communicate and make decisions.
Keeping those lines of communication open.
Exactly. Then you have liaison roles, those linking pin, people who connect specific units that need to work closely.
Okay.
For more complex stuff, you might create temporary teams or task forces, bringing people from different parts of the company to tackle specific projects.
Makes sense.
And the most formal way is with integrating units, either temporary teams dedicated to coordinating or even permanent structures, like in a matrix setup.
So different tools for different levels of complexity.
Exactly. Now, those are the formal ones, but what about those informal mechanisms?
Yeah, you mentioned those earlier. How do they help with global coordination?
Well, they're super important for filling in the gaps, where those formal structures fall short. A lot of multinationals, they create these knowledge networks supported by a culture that really values teamwork and cooperation across units.
So it's not just about the structure on paper, it's about the mindset.
Exactly. And knowledge management itself becomes a crucial part of this.
Right, making sure that knowledge flows freely throughout the company.
Exactly. And there are two main types of knowledge, explicit and tacit. Explicit knowledge is the stuff you can write down, put in a database, share easily through IT systems. Think of manuals, reports, data.
The stuff that's easy to capture and transmit.
Yeah, exactly. And international businesses use a lot of this. Things like MIS systems, shared databases, those performance dashboards, big data analytics, the whole Internet of Things.
Leveraging technology.
Absolutely. Then you have tacit knowledge. This is harder to explain. It's personal, gained through experience, intuition. It's hard to write down. It's more about learning by doing, observing others.
Like the tricks of the trade that you only learn from experience.
Exactly. Wilcox says the big challenge for these international businesses is managing both types of knowledge effectively. They need those formal systems for explicit knowledge, but they also need to cultivate those informal ways of sharing that tacit knowledge through networks, video calls, even internal social media.
So it's about creating a culture of knowledge sharing.
Right. And he uses those big four consulting firms as an example. They're really good at this. They use formal and informal approaches, those knowledge networks, supported by technology, and they build these communities of practice.
Communities of practice.
Yeah, where people doing similar jobs, even if they're in different countries, can connect, share what they've learned, and come up with new ideas together.
That sounds really valuable.
It is, but sometimes people are hesitant to share.
Knowledge is power. Right?
Exactly. Wilcox emphasizes that, regardless of their strategy, companies need to build that strong collaborative culture, make people want to share, want to help each other out.
That's a great point. Okay, so we've talked a lot about structure, coordination, and knowledge sharing, and all of this ties into that bigger concept you mentioned, organizational architecture, right?
Exactly. Wilcox argues that a well-designed organizational architecture is crucial for succeeding in today's global business world.
It's the foundation.
Right. He says if you align your strategy, structure, processes, culture, and people, your company will be way more effective, agile, and innovative.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. Gareth Hill, he has this framework for organizational architecture. He breaks it down into 5 key components. We've already talked about structure, but there's also control systems and incentives, people, processes, and culture.
Okay, so beyond structure, what are the key things to think about for those other elements?
Good question. So organizational culture and values, as we've said, define who the company is and how people within it interact.
The personality of the company.
Yeah, great way to put it. A strong culture can be really powerful. It can align everyone with the strategy, motivate people, create a positive environment.
But can culture ever be a bad thing?
Well, Wilcox says that a very strong home country culture, if it's not managed well, can actually be a problem when you're operating internationally.
It can clash with those local norms and values.
Exactly. Now, control systems and incentives are how a company measures performance and rewards behavior.
Like the carrot and the stick.
Kind of. You can have performance reviews, rules, targets, profit sharing, all sorts of things. But internationally, you have to be really careful about those cultural differences.
What motivates people in one country might not work in another.
Exactly. The people part is all about attracting, developing, and keeping those talented folks, the ones who have the right skills, mindset, and values. That's where HR comes in.
Finding the right people for the job.
Exactly. And finally, processes are how the work actually gets done. Those standard procedures that streamline things, boost productivity, and eliminate unnecessary steps.
So everything runs smoothly.
Right. Wilcox talks about core processes, which are key to the company's competitive advantage, and support processes, which keep things running smoothly but aren't as unique.
Okay.
When you're developing new products globally, for example, you need a holistic view of the process, making sure everyone across those different locations is working together effectively.
So when all these pieces of the organizational architecture are aligned, working together well, what's the payoff for the company?
The benefits are huge. You get that strong alignment between strategy, operations, and structure.
Everyone's on the same page, working towards the same goals.
Exactly. You're also more agile, able to adapt to those changes in the global landscape. Collaboration and innovation go up because you have that positive communicative culture.
That sounds like a recipe for success.
It is. And in the long run, this strong architecture helps build competitive advantage, attract and keep those talented people, and meet the needs of your customers worldwide. Wilcox says to be profitable internationally, you need that internal consistency, that alignment between the architecture and your strategy. And then, importantly, your whole strategy and architecture have to fit with the realities of the global market, those competitive conditions.
It's about being in tune with that external environment, right?
Exactly. Now, they talk about Dow Chemical in the materials you sent.
Oh, right.
It's a great case study.
Let's hear about it.
So they tried that matrix structure, remember?
The one with the 2 bosses.
Yep. But they had some rough patches, didn't perform as well as they'd hoped. They tweaked it a bit, then eventually switched to a global business division structure.
Interesting.
It shows how complex this stuff is, how structures evolve. And the materials you sent, they actually asked some good questions about Dow's experience, like why did they go with the matrix in the first place? Why didn't it work out? And what made them change?
Makes you think, right?
Definitely something to ponder.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've learned so much about how international businesses organize themselves, from the basics of centralization and decentralization, the different structural options, the relationship between strategy and structure.
It's a dynamic relationship.
Right. Not always a one-way street.
Yeah.
We talked about the pros and cons of each structure, how crucial coordination and integration are, both the formal mechanisms and the informal ones, especially knowledge management. And we touched on that bigger picture, organizational architecture.
Aligning all the pieces for success.
Exactly. Hopefully this has helped clear up some of the confusion around this topic. It can be pretty dense stuff.
It can be, but it's essential knowledge for anyone who wants to understand how these global companies operate.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, it makes you wonder about the future, right?
It does.
The global business world is changing so fast. New technologies, new challenges. What kinds of organizational structures will we see in the future? How will companies balance that need for global integration with being responsive to local markets, especially in our interconnected world?
Great questions. And honestly, there's no easy answer.
It's something to keep thinking about.
Definitely. But understanding these principles, it gives you a framework for analyzing these companies, seeing why some succeed and others stumble.
A lens for understanding the global business world.
Exactly. It's an exciting time to be following all this.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.